Morgan Freeman, an Oscar winner, has been a quiet but irreplaceable presence in cinema for more than half a century, a living legend whose voice has redefined the way the world listens to truth, calm, and wisdom in Hollywood. From the prisoner Red in The Shawshank Redemption to the image of God in Bruce Almighty, he has conquered the biggest roles not through showiness, but through composure, depth, and a world-weariness forged over time that nothing can fake. Millions trust him as a symbol of wisdom, patience, and a kind of peace that everyone craves, but few ever truly achieve. His voice does not just tell stories. It guides, reassures, and makes people believe that everything will be okay. But behind that voice that puts the whole world at ease is a story that is far from smooth and has stretched on in silence. An unstable childhood, growing up amid family gaps that could not be filled, where the presence of relatives did not mean connection. The years that were forgotten, working in the shadows of an industry that refused to see him, where talent was not enough to be recognized without the right timing, and the timing always came too late. A journey so long that success only appeared when he had already lived most of his life, when his energy was no longer abundant and his faith had been tested to the limit many times. A body injured after a serious accident, carrying pain that never truly disappears. A daily reminder that time does not just pass but also leaves marks. A family loss that came too suddenly, leaving a void that cannot be named, where there is no explanation and no way to go back. And the things he has never spoken about, not because there is nothing to say, but because there are pains that cannot be expressed in words, that can only exist in the silence stretching through the years. And now at the age of 88, when the pace of life slows down and the mornings become quieter, when every step carries the weight of time and memories, what is really happening behind the voice that the whole world has come to trust, in the shadows of fame and the memories that have never left him? Things that perhaps even he himself has never fully escaped. Before stepping into the story behind the voice that the whole world has trusted, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to listen together to the full journey that few know about. That is how you give a small token of respect to a man who has silently endured throughout his life, but still continues to move forward. Morgan Freeman's childhood did not begin with spotlights or words of encouragement, but with long gaps that no child could truly understand. He was born in Memphis, a place not far from the glamour of America, but not close enough to touch the opportunities that many others had. His family was not a solid place to hold on to, but more like a fragile structure that could crack at any moment. His parents were not really together in the full sense, and from very early on he felt that distance not through words but through absence, through evenings without enough laughter, through moments that should have had warmth but only had silence. There was no loud separation, no long arguments, but the estrangement was still there, quiet and persistent, like a crack that could not be seen but grew wider over time. When he was little, he was sent to live with his grandmother in Mississippi, and that was where he grew up for most of his childhood memories. For many people, that could have been care, a way to protect him. But for a child, it was also a feeling of being separated, as if he did not really belong anywhere. He was not with his parents, but he was not completely part of the life his grandmother was used to. The days passed in a house not built by his parents, with habits not formed by his own family, and gradually he learned not to expect too much from being close to anyone. Some children grow up with a feeling of being protected, while he grew up with a feeling that he had to understand himself on his own. Life did not stay in one place long enough to become familiar. His family moved, not by choice but by circumstance. Different towns, different roads, different houses, but the feeling was always the same. A feeling of not belonging that did not change. There was no place he could call home in the way others understood, because before he could get used to one place, he had to leave. Friends did not stay long enough to become deep memories. Relationships stayed on the surface, and every move was a new beginning. but not with excitement, but with quiet acceptance. It was during those years that something inside him began to form, not as something standout, not as something expressive, but as silence. He was not a talkative child, not someone who sought attention, but someone who stood in the back, observing, listening, and remembering. When you are not sure where you belong, you learn not to take up too much space. You learn to become smaller to fit into wherever you are placed. He observed adults talking, observed how they reacted, how they stayed silent, and gradually he understood that some things could be felt without needing to be spoken. Perhaps that observation became the foundation for the person he would later become. Someone who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. Someone who could convey emotion just with his eyes and his voice. But at that time, it was not a talent, but only a way to survive. When you do not have much to hold on to, you learn to rely on yourself. When you are not assured that someone will always be there, you learn not to depend on the presence of others. And when you do not have a clear place to call home, you begin to carry home inside yourself, a place no one can see, but no one can take away either. Those years were not loud. There were no big events that drew attention, but that very silence left the deepest mark. There was no specific moment to point to that everything had changed. But over time, he became a different person, quieter, more reserved, and with an invisible distance from the world around him. And perhaps from very early on, he already understood something that many people take a lifetime to realize, that not everyone is born with a sense of belonging. And sometimes, life is not about finding that place, but about learning how to live without it. And then, as those childhood years passed in that silence, something began to stir inside Morgan Freeman. Not a clear dream, not a path already laid out, but only a vague feeling every time he stood on the small stage at school, every time he took part in simple plays, where the lights were not bright but enough to make him feel that there he was no longer invisible. There, for the first time, someone saw him, listened to him, and that, for a child who had gotten used to being left behind, was a feeling that was almost impossible to describe. But even when he realized he loved acting, he still did not dare believe that it could be his path, because that dream seemed too far from the reality he was living. A reality where money was always scarce, where opportunities did not appear naturally, and where people like him rarely got the chance to step into that world. So, when it came time to choose, he did not choose the dream, but chose safety, a choice that many in his situation would make. He joined the United States Air Force, not because it was something he craved, but because it was the clearest path ahead, a path that could guarantee he would have a position, a role, a specific direction in life, something he had never really had before. During his years in the military, he learned discipline, learned how to exist in a system with order, but at the same time, he also realized something he had tried to avoid, that even if he could adapt to that life, he did not belong to it. There was a void inside that discipline could not fill, a feeling that he was living a life that was not his own. After leaving the military, he did not step right into a new path. There was no clear plan, no specific goal, but only a long period of drifting, where each day looked like the one before, and the future had no clear shape. He took different jobs, trying to find something that could make him feel he was heading in the right direction. But the more he searched, the more he realized that no choice truly made him feel complete. There were times when he wondered if he had missed the only chance to pursue what he loved, if that door had closed long ago, before he could get close. But then, in a moment that was not too loud, not a big turning point that anyone could notice, he decided to return to acting, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he could not continue living with a feeling that he had not tried. When he made that decision, he was no longer a young man with a lot of time ahead, but someone who had gone through many years of uncertainty, many years of not belonging anywhere. And that made his step heavier, because he knew that if he failed this time, he might not have any other chance. when he stepped into the acting world seriously, he realized he was starting at a disadvantage. The people around him were younger, faster, more confident. They had connections and opportunities he did not have, and while they were moving forward, he was still trying to find his footing. He took classes, worked on stage, took tiny roles to the point where sometimes he himself wondered if anyone really noticed him, and in those moments, doubt began to appear. Not like a storm, but like a constant whisper, asking him whether he really belonged here or not. He was not someone who entered the industry with absolute confidence, not someone who believed he was born to succeed, but on the contrary, he carried all those years of being forgotten, all those times of not being seen, and that kept him standing between two feelings. One side the desire to continue, the other side the fear that he was only prolonging a dream that would never become reality. And perhaps the hardest thing was not the competition, not the rejections, but having to face himself every day, having to ask himself whether he was going in the right direction or not, whether all these efforts would lead to something, or if it was just a long road with no clear destination. And then the following years in Morgan Freeman's life were not a journey of moving forward, but more like a long stretch of time where everything seemed to stand still, where each day passed without any sign of change, where he existed in a world that was moving but had no place for him. He began working on stage, taking roles so small that sometimes his name was not even mentioned in the programs, standing on modest stages with sparse audiences, where the lights were not bright enough to turn anyone into a star, and where each performance ended without leaving any clear trace. He also appeared on television, in shows that people watched and then forgot. Roles that were not big enough to be remembered, not important enough to change his life, and not strong enough to make Hollywood stop and take notice. There was no breakthrough moment, no role that changed everything overnight. No surprise phone call saying his life was about to turn to a new page. Only repetition, day after day, role after role, all similar in one point. They did not bring him any closer to what he had vaguely pursued for so long. Meanwhile, the world around him kept going. New faces appeared, other names started being mentioned, and he was still there, not moving forward, but not completely leaving either, as if he was standing on a border that even he did not know whether he should keep going or turn back. To survive, he could not rely only on acting, because those roles were not enough to support a person. He took many different jobs, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to. Jobs unrelated to the dream he had chosen, but they were what helped him continue living through each day. There were days that started very early and ended very late, not with satisfaction, but with fatigue, and sometimes with a feeling of emptiness that was hard to name. The money earned was not a reward for talent, but only the result of trying to survive in a world that was not easy at all. And through all of that, acting was still there, like something not strong enough to change his life, but also not weak enough for him to give up completely. Perhaps the hardest thing was not poverty or hardship, but the feeling that he was there, existing, working, but no one really saw him. He was not invisible in the literal sense, but in an industry where attention was everything. Not being seen was like not existing. He went to auditions, waited, hoped, then left without a clear answer. Only vague promises that they would call back, promises that mostly never became reality. Each time like that, he had to remind himself that this was part of the process, that not everyone succeeded right away, but as the days went by, that reminder became harder to believe. Time passed without creating any clear change. The years followed one after another, and if looking from the outside, no one might notice the difference between this year and the next in his life. There were no big steps forward, no memorable milestones, only a long chain of similar days where hope gradually became thinner and faith in the future began to be tested quietly. He was not someone who gave up easily, but he was also not someone who did not feel the exhaustion. And there were times when he wondered whether all of this was really leading anywhere. But the strange thing was, Even in those years when everything seemed unchanged, something inside him continued to exist. Not as strong belief, not as certainty, but as an inexplicable persistence, a silent refusal in the face of the thought that his life would always be like this. He continued to take roles, continued to appear, continued to do what he could, not because he saw a bright future ahead, but because he did not know any other way to live except to keep moving forward. And while the world did not see him, he was still there, not standing out, not recognized, but also not disappearing, a quiet presence in a noisy industry, waiting for something that even he was not sure would ever come. And then there came a period for Morgan Freeman where the difficulty no longer lay in being rejected, but in having to watch others being accepted, not once, but repeatedly through the years, when faces that once stood with him in narrow hallways, small stages, silent auditions, began to appear on the big screen, began to be named, began to have a place. And while they moved forward, he remained right where he had stood for so long, as if time for him did not flow at the same pace as the rest of the world. Familiar names gradually became distant, not because they changed, but because the gap between them and him grew larger. A gap that could not be measured by footsteps, but by opportunities, by recognition, by things he still did not have. There were evenings when he sat alone, watching movies that were playing, realizing faces that were once his co-stars, once people in the same position as him, had now become stars that people mentioned with admiration. And in that moment, it was not jealousy, but a feeling hard to name, an emptiness mixed with a question he could not avoid, that why not him? What had he done wrong? Or perhaps he had not been good enough from the beginning. But those questions had no clear answers, and over time, they did not disappear, but only became more familiar. Like a part of life he was forced to accept, the pressure of age began to creep in quietly but undeniably. When you are young, you can tell yourself there is still time, that everything will come, that just keep trying is enough. But when the years pass, when opportunities do not appear, when others have gone much further, then that saying begins to lose its weight. He was no longer the youngest in the audition room, no longer someone who could be seen as potential, but gradually became someone overlooked because he did not fit, not because of lack of talent, but because the timing no longer stood on his side. His career, if looked at from the outside, seemed to have no clear progress, no big roles, no breakthrough, no sign that everything was about to change. Only the repetition of efforts, tries, hopes then disappointments, and a circle with no clear end. There were times when he stood in front of the mirror, looking at himself, and wondered whether all of this was really worth it, whether he was pursuing a path where the destination did not exist, or if it was simply not time yet. But if not time yet, then when was that time? And whether he still had enough time to wait. The question of whether to continue or stop did not come like a storm, but came quietly, repeating in his thoughts, especially in the most tiring moments, when work brought no results, when money became tight, when the future was unclear, and when there was no one standing beside him to say he was going in the right direction. There was no sign from the outside that he should continue, no confirmation that what he was doing would lead to something good, and in that silence, the decision to continue became harder than ever. But what made him different was not that he had no doubts, but that he did not stop. He did not have a great belief that everything would be okay, did not have certainty that success was waiting ahead, but only one thing: a quiet refusal to give up. He continued to go to auditions, continued to take small roles, continued to work without any guarantee that it would change his life. Each step was not guided by clear hope, but by a habit that had become instinct, a persistence that needed no reason. Perhaps, at some point, he understood that not everyone has an early shining moment, that some paths do not lead to the peak quickly, but stretch long, winding, and sometimes seem to lead nowhere at all. But instead of stopping, he chose to keep going. Not because he knew for sure there would be light ahead, but because he could not turn back, and he could not stand still either. And through all those years, when he saw others succeed, when he clearly felt his own delay, he was still there, not moving faster, not being noticed more, but also not disappearing, like a persistent existence in a world always in motion, waiting for something that perhaps even he did not dare to be sure would happen. And then, after all those years, when even Morgan Freeman himself was no longer sure what he was waiting for, one last opportunity appeared. Not loud, not brilliant, not like the way people usually tell about life-changing turning points, but quietly like a door opening when one had almost accepted that it would never open again. That was the role in the movie Street Smart, a role that was not central, not written specifically for him, but it was the first role that made people really stop and look at him as an actor, not just a name passing through a long list of those who had tried and not succeeded. When he got that role, he was no longer a young man with eyes full of expectation, no longer someone who believed that just one chance would change everything immediately, but someone who had gone through too many disappointments to understand that nothing was certain, that even this chance could pass without leaving anything. He stepped into the role, not with excitement, but with a nearly silent focus, as if he understood that this was not a normal step forward, but a final try of life for himself. During the work, he did not try to impress, did not attempt anything beyond his ability, but did only one thing, the best he could, bringing all the years he had gone through, all the emotions that had accumulated, all the times of being forgotten, rejected, overlooked, into every look, every line, every silence of the character. Perhaps that was why that role was not like other roles. It was not built only by technique, but by a life that by that point had been long enough to understand silence, deep enough to understand pain without needing to speak it out. When the movie was released, what he had waited for many years finally happened. People began to notice, not like a big wave, not an immediate explosion, but enough to create a difference. Enough to make the name Morgan Freeman no longer overlooked. Enough to make those who had not seen him before stop a little longer. That role brought him an Oscar nomination. A recognition that, if it had come earlier, might have meant something different. But when it came at this time, it was not a victory, but a confirmation that he had not been completely wrong in continuing this path. But what was notable was that even when recognized, he did not feel he had won in the way people usually imagine. There was no bursting feeling, no overflowing joy, but only a very deep relief, as if an invisible burden was finally put down somewhat, as if he could breathe out after a long stretch, where before he had not realized he was holding his breath. Success came, but it did not erase the years that had passed, did not make him forget the feeling of being forgotten, and also did not bring him the innocence of someone just starting. He realized that this opportunity was not like what people usually say about opportunities. It was not a door leading to a completely new world, but a small gap that he had to widen himself, had to hold on to himself. No one guaranteed that after this role everything would become easier. No one promised that the road ahead would open wide, and precisely because of that, he understood that this was not the time to rest, but the time to continue, even to continue with more effort than before. At an age when many people had already reached their peak or had begun to slow down, he was at the starting point of recognition, a starting point that was no longer youthful, no longer had much time to try and fail, no longer had many chances to make mistakes. That did not frighten him in an obvious way, but it made every decision heavier, every role more important, and every step carried the awareness that he could not waste what he had just gained. And perhaps the deepest thing he realized at that time was not that he had succeeded, but that he was still here after all those years when he could have given up. After all those times when this path brought nothing, he still continued, not because he knew for sure this would happen, but because he did not know any other way except to keep moving forward. The opportunity came late, but not too late, and in his familiar silence, he understood that the only thing he could do now was to seize it, not with the confidence of someone sure to win, but with the persistence of someone who had gotten used to nothing being certain. And then, after the small door that he had to open himself, bigger opportunities finally began to find Morgan Freeman. But they did not come at a gentle time, did not come when he was still young enough to feel everything like a dream that had just begun, but came when his life had already carried too much weight, too many memories, and too many years in which he had learned not to expect anything. When he appeared in Driving Miss Daisy, his role was not just a character, but like a reflection of his own person, a quiet, patient man carrying experience that did not need to be spoken. And this time, the audience did not just see him, they really stopped to listen, to feel, to understand. The movie was not only successful, but also brought him closer to what had once seemed too distant: widespread recognition, respect, and a clear position in the industry that he had spent nearly his entire life trying to step into. But if Driving Miss Daisy was the door that opened, then The Shawshank Redemption was the moment that made his name unforgettable. In the role of Red, he did not need to shout, did not need to overact, but only needed to be present. With his deep, warm voice, with eyes that carried an entire lifetime, and that was enough to make the audience trust him, not as an actor, but as a real person telling the story of his own life. That role was not just a success, but a milestone, a point from which he was no longer someone standing on the sidelines, but became an indispensable part of cinema. From then on, he gradually became a familiar face, someone the audience recognized right away when he appeared, not because he tried to stand out, but because he carried a presence that few had, a calmness, a certainty, a feeling that everything he said had weight. The following roles, whether big or small, were seen differently, no longer efforts to be noticed, but choices of someone who had found his place. But what was notable was that even though he had achieved what he once pursued, he never really stepped into it with the lightness of a winner. Success came when he had already gone through so many difficulties, and that changed the way he felt about everything. There was no innocence, no feeling that everything was new and full of promise, but instead a clear awareness that every opportunity had its price, that every role was the result of a long journey where he had not known if it was worth it until he stood here. When others saw him as a symbol, he still saw his own self from the years before, the one who stood outside auditions, the one who waited without knowing if he would be called, and that made him unable to fully enjoy what he had in the way people imagined. The past did not disappear when the present changed. It was still there, not as a constant burden, but as a foundation on which everything new was built. Each time he stepped into a role, he brought not only skill, but also the years that had passed, the rejections, the periods when no one saw him, and that was exactly what gave his roles a depth that could not be created by technique alone. But at the same time, it also made him unable to completely separate the real person from the image on screen, because for him, acting was not a complete transformation, but a way to reveal what had existed inside for so long. At a time when many people thought he had reached the peak, he looked at everything with a different calmness, not because he did not appreciate what he had, but because he understood that success was not the end point, and it was not the answer to everything he had been through. It did not erase the difficult years, did not change what had shaped him, and did not bring a completely fulfilled feeling. It was only a part of the journey, a part he had to travel for a very long time to reach, but not the final part. And perhaps what made his story different was not that he had succeeded, but that he came to success when life was no longer light, when everything carried the depth of time, of memories, and of things that could not be returned to. He did not step into the light with the innocence of someone just starting, but with the quietness of someone who had walked through darkness for too long to still believe that the light would be there forever, and that was exactly what made everything he did Every role he chose and every word he spoke carry a weight that not everyone could fully understand. But then when everything seemed to be in its right place, when the name Morgan Freeman was no longer overlooked and each time he appeared carried almost absolute trust from the audience, another truth began to emerge, quietly but undeniably, that fame did not bring inner peace as people thought. He had work, recognition, roles that anyone in the industry would crave. But when the lights went out and everything returned to the familiar quiet, he was still there with himself, with thoughts that were not easy to name, with a void that no role could completely fill. People looked at him and saw a symbol of stability. But inside, that stability did not always exist. The more he worked, the more the pressure increased in a way that was not easy to notice from the outside. A packed schedule, projects following one after another, expectations growing larger from the public and from the industry itself that he had taken so many years to step into. Each role was not just an opportunity, but also a responsibility. A reminder that he was no longer someone who could make mistakes without anyone noticing. That made every decision heavier. Every choice carried a part of the past that he could not separate from. He no longer worked only out of passion, but also for something deeper. A need to prove that the years that had passed were not meaningless, that the path he had chosen, even if late, still had its meaning. But even when work filled the time, it could not fill the feeling of lacking deep connection that he had carried for so long. He had colleagues, relationships in the industry, but most of them existed within the framework of work, not connections that one could rely on when everything became silent. He was not someone who opened up easily, not someone who actively sought closeness, and that made the invisible gaps still exist, even when there were many people around him. There were evenings that ended not with laughter or sharing, but with prolonged quiet, where he returned to himself again, just as he had gotten used to from the early years of his life. What had happened before did not disappear just because the present had changed. The years of being forgotten, the times of not being seen, the periods when he had to wonder if he really belonged here. All of that was still there, not as clear as before, but enough to affect the way he saw everything. Success did not erase memories. It only placed them in a different context where people could easily forget that they once existed. But for him, they remained an inseparable part. Each time he stood in front of the camera, each time he heard his name mentioned with respect, a part of him still remembered the days when that seemed like it would never happen. Perhaps the hardest thing to accept was not that success came late, but that it could not replace what had been lost. It could not bring back the years that had passed, could not mend the relationships that had cracked, could not erase the moments when he had felt he did not belong anywhere. It could not make everything whole in the way people still hoped. It was only a part of life, an important part, but not everything. And when he realized that, the way he viewed success also changed. It was no longer the final goal, but only a stopping point on a journey much longer than what people could see. Through all of that, he still continued, still worked, still appeared, still brought audiences the roles they loved. But beneath it all, there was a truth not easy to say, that success did not always bring relief, that sometimes it only made the things still missing become clearer, and perhaps that was exactly why he never fully immersed himself in the spotlight, never let it define his entire self, because he understood that there were things more important that he had not gotten, and those things could not be replaced, no matter how much he achieved. And then, when work continued to fill the gaps that life left behind, another part of Morgan Freeman's life was also quietly unfolding, not as brilliant as the stage lights, but leaving deeper marks. That was the relationships he had tried to maintain, but could not keep fully intact. He entered marriage not as someone who had never been through hardship, but as someone who had already carried many years of silence, many gaps that were not easy to fill, and those things precisely made building real closeness far more complicated than what people could see from the outside. His first marriage came at a time when life was still unstable. when his career had no clear foundation, when the pressures of finances and the future still existed every day. In such circumstances, affection was not always enough to hold everything together, and over time, cracks began to appear, not from a single event, but from small things that accumulated, silences that were not filled, emotions that were not spoken. The marriage ended not with a sudden breakdown, but with a prolonged distance to the point where there was nothing left to hold on to. When he stepped into his second marriage, he was different, more mature, with more experience, and had also begun to find his place in his career. But what many people did not realize was that success did not make loving any easier. On the contrary, it brought different pressures, different distances, especially when life was divided between work and family, between long trips and periods when they could not be together. The cracks did not disappear, they only changed shape, becoming more subtle, harder to notice, but still existing. He was not someone who easily expressed emotions, not someone who could say everything he thought, and that, over time, created an invisible distance between him and those closest to him. There were things that were not spoken, not because they did not exist, but because there was no way to express them. And when those things accumulated, they became gaps that no one knew how to fill. Two people could be together in the same space, sharing the same life, but still feel distant in a way that could not be explained in words. The second marriage lasted many years, long enough for people to believe it would be lasting. But in the end, it also came to its conclusion, not because of a lack of effort, but because there were gaps that could not be narrowed, no matter how hard both tried. Divorce was not only the end of a relationship, but also carried other losses, not only financially when a large part of the assets had to be divided again, but also mentally, when what had been built over many years no longer existed in the old way. After all, what remained was not resentment or blame, but a quiet feeling about the things that could not be kept, about what had once been there but could not continue. Family relationships, though still existing, were not completely connected in the way people expected. There was care, there was presence, but not always deep closeness, not always the feeling that all distances had been erased. Perhaps the hardest thing to accept was not that a relationship ended, but realizing that even when one had tried, there were still things that could not be changed. Emotional distance did not always come from a lack of care, but sometimes came from the very way each person had been shaped from the years before. And for him, a person who had grown up in silence, in gaps that were not easy to fill, carrying that into relationships was almost unavoidable. And so, even when he was beside someone else, a part of him still kept a private space, not because he wanted to be separate, but because that was the way he had learned to survive from very long ago. A distance that was not visible, not spoken, but always present, like an inseparable part of who he was. A part that success could not change, that time could not erase, and that even love, sometimes, could not completely overcome. And then, as if life had not had enough cracks, another incident happened to Morgan Freeman, not coming from relationships, not from choices, but from a moment he could not control. One night in 2008, when everything changed in just a few short seconds, when the car he was driving lost control on a dark road and rolled over many times, turning a normal journey into a serious accident whose consequences could not be measured right then. There was no time to think, no chance to prepare, only a feeling of chaos as everything around shattered, and then the heavy silence afterward, a quiet in which the line between living and dying became thinner than ever. That moment was not like what people see in movies. There was no music, no final words, only a cold reality that everything could end right there, on a road that before had no special meaning. He was pulled out of the car in a badly injured state, his body no longer responding as before, and in the first hours, no one could be sure what would happen next. It was no longer a story about career or fame, but about whether he could continue to exist or not, a simple question, but also the biggest question a person could face. The days after passed in the hospital under cold white lights and the familiar smell of antiseptic, where time was not measured by schedules or work, but by heartbeat, by small signs that the body was still fighting to recover. He suffered many serious injuries, especially to his arm and shoulder. Injuries that not only caused physical pain, but also threatened his ability to move in the future. For a person who had spent his whole life expressing emotions through his body and voice, losing control over his own body was not just an injury, but a profound change in the way he existed. As he gradually recovered, one truth became clearer, that life after the accident would never be the same as before. The pain did not disappear when the wounds healed, but stayed, becoming a part of every day, a part he could not avoid, could not ignore, only learn to live with. His left arm was heavily affected, losing most of its feeling, forcing him to wear a compression glove to reduce the discomfort. A small detail, but enough to remind him every day of what had happened. His life changed not only on the physical level, but also in the way he viewed everything. Before, he had gotten used to continuing despite difficulties. But now, every step had to be considered. Every movement carried awareness of the new limits of his body. There was no longer the freedom as before, no longer the ability to trust that his body would always respond to what he asked. That did not make him stop, but it changed the way he moved forward. Slower, more careful, and perhaps also more realistic. There was no moment when he completely returned to the way he was, because that was simply impossible. What had been lost could not be fully restored, and what remained had to be accepted in the way it existed. He continued to work, continued to appear on screen, but behind those roles was a person who had crossed a boundary that not everyone had to face, a boundary between continuing and ending. And perhaps the most notable thing was not that he had survived, but the way he lived afterward. Not like someone who had escaped death, but like someone carrying the memory of it. A memory that did not need to be repeated but was always present in every movement, every silence. That accident was not just an event, but a dividing point. A before and an after, and between the two was a person who had changed in a way that not everyone could see, but he himself understood more clearly than anyone else. But what the accident in 2008 left for Morgan Freeman did not stop at the visible wounds or the days lying in the hospital, but stretched on for a very long time afterward, quietly but persistently, like something that never left completely. That was the nerve damage he had to carry from that day until now. A kind of pain unlike what people usually think. Not a pain that came and went, but a continuous presence. Sometimes light, sometimes heavy, but never completely gone. The affected nerves made his left arm no longer function as before, losing most of its feeling, sometimes numb, sometimes sharp with pain. And there were days when even a small movement became much more difficult than before. That pain did not stay in one specific spot, but spread out, affecting his entire way of living each day. Things that seemed simple, like holding an object, maintaining a posture, or just keeping stability in the body, all became small but constantly repeated challenges. There were no days off, no periods of complete comfort, only adaptation, little by little, to a body that was no longer the same. And the hardest thing was not having to endure the pain, but knowing that it would not disappear, that this was not a temporary phase, but a part of life from then on. To reduce the discomfort, he began wearing a compression glove on his left hand, a detail that many people might see but not fully understand its meaning. It was not an accessory, but a necessary support. A way to keep the pain from becoming too much. A way for him to continue using his hand at the minimum level. But even with that support, everything still did not return to the way it was. And each time he looked at his hand, he saw not just a part of his body, but an irreversible change. What was notable was that even though his body had changed, he did not stop. He still continued to work, continued to take roles, continued to stand in front of the camera and bring audiences what they expected. But behind every scene was an effort that not everyone saw. The long working hours were no longer as easy as before. Movements had to be calculated more carefully, and there were times when the pain appeared right in the middle of his work. But he could not stop. Not because he did not want to, but because he had chosen to continue from very long ago. Perhaps what made this story special was not that he endured the pain, but the way he accepted it. He did not try to deny it, did not try to hide it completely, but learned to live with it as a part of himself. There were better days, there were worse days, but there was no day completely without pain. And instead of fighting against that, he gradually changed the way he looked at it, no longer seeing it as something that needed to be removed, but as something that needed to be understood and adapted to. In his familiar silence, he did not talk much about what he was going through, did not turn it into a story to tell, but kept it as a private part of his life, just like the way he had kept many other things from before until now. But right in that silence, there was something clearer, that he was not defined by what was perfect, but by the way he continued when everything was no longer perfect. And perhaps, in some way, the pain had become a part of the rhythm of his life. Not something he wished for, but something he had learned to carry, like an unerasable memory, like a reminder that time does not just pass, but also leaves marks. But even while carrying that mark, he still kept moving forward. Not as fast as before, not as easily as before, but still continuing in the way he had always done. Not because he was sure everything would get better, but because he had never learned how to stop. But if the physical pain was something Morgan Freeman could learn to adapt to, then there were losses that did not give him that chance, did not give him time to understand, and did not leave a clear enough explanation to accept. And the biggest shock in the later years came in 2015, when his granddaughter, Edina Hines, was brutally murdered in New York City, an event that not only shocked the public, but also broke a very deep part inside him in a way that no one could fully see. Edina was not just a relative, but an important part of his life, someone he had watched over, cared for and loved in his own very particular way, a connecting thread that in a life full of gaps like his was not always easy to have. And then, in just one moment, it was all cut off, with no warning, no chance to prepare. Only the cold truth that a person who had once been present in his life was no longer there. And the most painful thing was not just the departure, but the way it happened. Too sudden, too cruel to be understood. Unlike other losses in his life where time could somewhat help a person accept, this event did not bring him any feeling of closure. There was no clear answer to the question of why, no reason strong enough to soothe the pain, and in that absence, the emotions did not explode, but settled down, becoming heavier, harder to name. He did not appear before the public with long statements, did not recount the details of what he felt, but chose silence. A silence not because there was nothing to say, but because there were too many things that words could not express. Those around him could notice the change, not through clear statements or actions, but through smaller things, through the way he became quieter, through longer pauses in his speech, through eyes that carried something that had not been there before. He still continued to appear, still worked, still maintained the image the public was familiar with, but beneath it all, something had changed. Not completely gone, but no longer the same as before. That loss was not shown outwardly in the way people usually see, with no moments of collapse in front of the camera, no emotional speeches, but only a prolonged silence, a way of facing it that only those who had gotten used to keeping everything inside could understand. And right in that silence, the pain did not disappear, but existed in a different way, not loud, but persistent, like a part of life that he had to carry with no other choice. The way he viewed life afterward also changed, not suddenly, but gradually, through each day, through each thought. Things that were once considered important no longer held the same place. Priorities shifted, and perhaps a part of him began to see everything with a more realistic eye, Not pessimistic, but no longer holding on to illusions that everything could always be explained or fixed. He understood that there were things that happened without a clear enough reason, losses that people could do nothing but accept their existence. And perhaps the hardest thing was not facing the pain in the first days, but continuing to live with it as time passed, when the outside world gradually returned to its normal rhythm, when people around continued their lives, while he still carried a part of the memory that no one else could fully share. That pain did not disappear, did not lessen in an easily noticeable way, but only changed shape, became more familiar, became a part of the silences in daily life. And once again, like many times before in his life, he did not choose to show it outwardly, but kept it inside. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because that was the only way he knew to continue. Not to overcome, not to forget, but to live with it, in the way he had learned from very early on, that there were things in life that could not be changed, and the only thing a person could do was to keep moving forward, carrying everything that had happened, no matter how heavy it was. And then, after all the incidents that no role could fully describe, Morgan Freeman gradually moved away from the noisy pace of the place that had made his name, not by a sudden decision, but by a slow, almost natural retreat, as if life itself had led him to a quieter place, where he could exist without needing to be seen. He returned to Mississippi, the land that had been connected to his childhood, not like a person coming back to find what had been lost, but like a person who had understood that he no longer needed to be in the middle of the lights to prove anything. His life there was not like the image many people imagine of a Hollywood legend. There were no big parties, no constant appearances in front of the camera, but days passing in quietness with simple repeating habits, mornings that began slowly, not rushed by a packed schedule, not dominated by expectations from the outside. He spent time on small things that before he might not have had the chance to fully feel, like taking care of his land, observing nature, and especially beekeeping, an activity that for others might just be a hobby, but for him carried a deeper meaning, a way to connect with a different rhythm of life, a rhythm without hurry, without demands, simply existing. In that space, he was no longer a star, no longer a name that people had to mention with respect, but just a person living with what he had, without needing to explain, without needing to perform. Perhaps that very simplicity brought him a feeling that before he did not easily have, not happiness in the way people usually define, but a quietness enough for him to hear himself, not overwhelmed by the noise of the outside world. He appeared before the media less, not because he was no longer of interest, but because he no longer sought that attention. His appearances became fewer, interviews decreased, and even when he appeared, he did not say much about personal things, still keeping a distance that he had maintained for many years. There was no need to explain his life, no need to share what he had been through, because perhaps he understood that not everything needed to be told to have meaning. His daily activities were not performative, not something to be recorded or shared, but simply things that helped him continue living in the way he felt was right. The mornings, the afternoons, the periods of time passing without any special events. But right in those silences, he gradually found a different kind of stability, not coming from success, but from accepting what had happened and not trying to change what could not be changed. The distance between him and the entertainment world became clearer, not because he was pushed out, but because he chose to step back. Hollywood was still there, still continuing with its rhythm, with new faces, new stories, and he was no longer the center of all that anymore. But that did not bring a feeling of loss, as one might think, but more like a natural transition from one stage of life to another, where he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. And in that stillness, there was something both clearer and harder to name, that after everything he had been through, after all the losses, the pains, the years of being forgotten, and the years of being recognized, what he was seeking no longer lay in what the world could bring, but in what he could keep for himself, a small space, a slow rhythm of life, an existence that did not need to be confirmed by anyone else. But even when Morgan Freeman's life had become quieter, when the distance between him and the noisy world of Hollywood became clearer, another truth also gradually emerged, not with intensity, but with an undeniable quietness, that everything he had built over many decades, fame, recognition, assets, and the position he had achieved, still could not completely fill the gaps inside him. From the outside, he had everything that many people spent their whole lives pursuing: an impressive career, a respected name, and a life no longer limited by material difficulties as before. But when everything had reached what people called success, he saw more clearly the things that success could not touch. There were gaps not related to money or fame, but deeper, related to relationships that could not be kept whole, moments that had passed and could not be returned to, things that could have been different if time and circumstances had not taken everything in another direction. Family, though still existing as a part of his life, did not always bring a feeling of complete connection. There was presence, there was care, but there were also gaps that could not be erased. Gaps formed not in one day, but over many years, when each person followed their own path. And when looking back, he could realize that there were things that were not because of lack of effort, but simply could not be kept. Inside, the years that had passed still left marks, not as clear as before, but enough to affect the way he viewed life. Success did not bring liberation from what had happened. It only placed him in a different position, where he could look back at everything with a wider view, but also a clearer one. Memories did not disappear. They only became familiar, became a part of the way he thought, the way he reacted, and the way he existed in this world. There were times when he realized that even though he had come very far, a part of him still stood in those first years, where everything began, where the first gaps were formed. Right in this period, the value of simple things began to become clearer than ever. Not the big roles, not the awards, but the small moments, the quiet mornings, the conversations that did not need to be long, the seconds when he could exist without needing to play anyone else. Things that before might have been seen as ordinary now carried a different meaning, not because they changed, but because the way he looked at them had changed. He no longer searched for big things to prove his value, but gradually accepted that that value did not lie in what others saw, but in what he felt when there was no one around. But even when realizing that, the emptiness still did not completely disappear. It was no longer a clear feeling as before, no longer made him question every day, but it still existed, like a part of life that he did not try to deny. Success and emptiness did not exclude each other. They could exist side by side, and perhaps, for him, that was something he had gradually accepted, not as a failure, not as something that needed to be fixed, but only as a part of the journey he had gone through. And in that acceptance, there was something both gentler and deeper, that life did not always bring completeness in the way people expected, that there would always be things missing, but that did not mean what had been gained was meaningless. He did not try to fill all the gaps, did not try to make everything perfect, but only continued to live with what he had, with what he had been through, and with an understanding that not every story had a complete ending. And then, when looking back at the entire journey he had gone through, from the years of youth with no support to the present when time had left its mark on every movement, Morgan Freeman did not see a perfect story nor a complete ending in the way people usually tell, but only saw a series of stages following one another, with times of moving forward, times of stopping, times when it seemed he had lost everything, and times when he found back a part of himself. There was no straight line leading to success, but a winding, long road full of silences that only when he went through them did he understand their meaning. He was not someone who stepped out of his life with everything resolved. The pains did not disappear just because time passed. The memories did not fade just because the present had changed. They were still there, not as sharp as at the beginning, but enough to remind him of everything that had happened, of what had been lost, and of the things that could not be returned to. But instead of trying to erase them, he learned to let them exist, not as a constant heavy burden, but as a part of who he was, a part that if missing, he would no longer be himself. At an age when many people had chosen to stop, he still continued, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he had never really learned to live differently except by keeping moving forward. His body was no longer as before. The pains still existed. His energy was no longer abundant, but that did not stop him from appearing, did not stop him from working, did not stop him from bringing audiences the roles they still trusted. Each time he stood in front of the camera was no longer a step full of energy, but a conscious choice, a decision that even though everything had changed, he would still not stop. Perhaps what he left behind was not in the number of roles or the awards he had achieved, but in the way he had gone through all of that, not with perfection, not with a flawless image, but with persistence, a quiet perseverance that never disappeared. He was not someone who had never failed, but someone who did not let failure define his ending. He was not someone who did not know pain, but someone who had learned to live with pain without letting it stop his steps. And if there was one thing he had never spoken out loud, perhaps it was not a great secret, but only a simple truth, that life did not always bring what people expected, that there would always be things missing, things that would always hurt, and not everyone had the chance to heal completely. But that did not mean that life was not worth living, did not mean that what had been experienced was meaningless. The final image was not a person standing at the peak, nor a person who had let go of everything, but a human being still moving forward, slower, heavier, but still advancing. A person carrying invisible wounds, memories that could not be erased, but not letting them become the reason to stop. And perhaps, in his familiar silence, that was exactly what he had always wanted to say, not with words, but by the way he had lived throughout his entire life. The story of Morgan Freeman does not overwhelm people with glory, but makes them fall silent because of the long silences throughout a lifetime. From a childhood lacking family affection in Memphis, the years of being forgotten in the entertainment industry, until he was only recognized after the role in Street Smart, when he had already passed the youth period, when many others had shone long ago. And that precisely created a very real poignancy, because he not only fought against rejection, but also against time, which waits for no one. The tragedy did not stop there when the accident in 2008 made his body never return to the way it was, forcing him to live with nerve pain every day, or the painful loss when his granddaughter was murdered. An event with no clear explanation and no way to heal completely. And what hurts people the most is that he did not choose to reveal all of that, but kept it in silence. Continued working, continued living, as if the pain was an inseparable part of himself. That very silence highlighted his quality, not a perfect hero, but a real human being with real wounds, but still not stopping. For the American people, this story carries a very clear meaning, that success does not always come at the right time, and also cannot replace the losses in life. But the value of a person does not lie in avoiding difficulties, but in the way they continue when everything is no longer as desired. And in a society that always values speed and achievements, his slow but persistent journey is a reminder that sometimes the most worthy thing is not how early you reach the destination, but that you do not give up when the road becomes too long. If the story about Morgan Freeman makes you pause, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to show respect for a man who has quietly gone through his whole life with pain but did not stop. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you again in the next video, where we will continue to listen to the stories behind the spotlight that few truly understand.